So it's spooky season, and you know what that means. I am going to be focusing on releasing, or at least I'm going to try to release videos that have autumnal slash Halloween themes. And for today's video, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite things in literature, witches. I've always been fascinated with witches by themselves in film, in pop culture, in books, and I really wanted to make a video specifically focusing on witches. I did want to start by saying that the word witch is really broad because there are so many different types of witches. Like, I was investigating and I came up with witches such as like the green witch or the cosmic witch or even like the secular witch. So I decided to specifically focus on the historical type of witch because I think history is so important when looking at literature, and it teaches us that witches are dangerous and that they're supposed to be brought down and they're supposed to be punished and even silenced. So I wanted to focus once again on those specific types of witches, but also how they've been tortured and executed, and how women continue to be persecuted for witchcraft even today. So I wanted to talk about that, but also the more like poor and unprotected types of witches that are easier to blame. So let's start. So a little bit about history. With the witch hunts coming to a close in the late 18th century, the fear of these, witches began to diminish, and therefore it also became more popularized in society. And a great example of this is Jane Eyre. Now, Jane Eyre is not necessarily a witch book, and I'm not implying that Jane is like a witch, but when I was reading it, I was just interested how there's so many like references, and so many references to witches. For example, Mr. Rochester calls Jane, how well you read me, you witch, and he also calls her like sorceries and a spirit and someone who has the look of another world, but also Jane herself has a lot of dreams and visions, and she even consults a fortune teller, which is Mr. Rochester, but still. And she also paints a lot of interesting paintings with symbolic images, and I was very interested by the references. Now, once again, I'm not saying that Jane Eyre is a witch book. I don't know, I just thought some of these references were interesting. Maybe it's a bit of a stretch, I don't know. But now we're going to talk about some actual witches. So next up, we're going to talk about Circe. So she is important because she played a huge part on Homer's The Odyssey. And I'm not going to get into like the whole story, but she basically, there's a scene where she provides a meal to the crew, which transforms them into swine when they consume it. And then Odysseus and Circe become lovers, despite the fact that he literally has a loyal wife at home. But anyways, this is ironic because Circe becomes like the devil woman, while poor Odysseus is her helpless victim, apparently. And this is, once again, it tells us about the historical context of the time this book was set in, because it's an early example of the witch being the woman who the man cannot resist. Okay, so next up we have the Weird Sisters from Macbeth by William Shakespeare, or also spelled the Weird Sisters. So this trio of witches pretty much delivers the prophecies that set the entire play's course of events. So at the beginning of the book, these witches give Macbeth a prophecy that he's supposed to be the king, and Macbeth is actually also encouraged by his wife to kill the king and become the new king, and then he kills more people out of paranoia. But this actually does end up happening, and as described by Shakespeare himself, these witches have chappy fingers and skinny lips, and they also have very masculine features, like for example they have beards, and these characteristics are also kind of implemented in Lady Macbeth herself, which is like the other villainous female character of the play. When I was actually reading the play, the witches didn't just come off as skinny and unfeminine, but also as rather absurd and ridiculous because of how they rhymed. If you notice, I think they rhyme in tetrameter, but the way they rhyme is very like childish and usually kind of like innocent, but it just reduces the intimidating persona that they have. For example, when they say a double double, troil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. We have the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz. Anyways, so I wanted to start by saying that her look is pure West. I mean, the green skin, the yapping sneer, the pointed nose, and even the black hat. So I would say that like overall, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is a very interesting piece of literature to evaluate in the context of the depictions of the witch and of feminism. Now, I know it's like easy to say that like, oh, the cartoonish evil wicked witch of the West kind of like reflects on sexism of the 20th century when universal suffrage for women in the US has not arrived. You can say that, but also there's an explicitly good witch, Glinda, and she's a good witch of the South. So although it depicts the wicked witch of the West as evil, the other witch kind of like breaks, the established trope about witches being evil. So the other day I was reading this article about it's called The Last 400 Years of Witches in Fiction and Feminism, and it mentions how the author stumbled upon a quote on TV tropes about how cultural depictions of dragons varied according to the economic state of the country in which those depictions were published. But basically, authors portrayed dragons in fiction as good when the economy was doing well, and they were portrayed as bad when the economy was doing poorly. And they also gave some examples, like, for example, I think the dragons of Eyre were like idealized because the economy of 2008, which is when, the book was published, was doing good. But in contrast, the dragon from The Hobbit was greedy and it was malevolent, and that's because the book was published in the Great Depression. And I thought this was so interesting because dragons symbolize wisdom, power, good fortune, and even wealth. And the same thing kind of happens to witches in literature, because when witches are portrayed as good, essentially something progressive is happening to like women's liberation, and there's like a key milestone reached in feminist history. So authors would want a more positive portrayal of witches when they want a more gender equal society. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about a modern classic, Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. So at least compared to the other books that I've talked about, this one is more modern, and it's interesting because rather than being situated outside, this one is situated inside of this like cultural institution, and also it's told from the perspective of the witches and the wizards themselves instead of like being, I don't know, someone telling a story about the witches like we've seen in Macbeth, for example. But the witches in Harry Potter range from villains to heroes, and as I mentioned, they have male counterparts, wizards, who are pretty much equivalent to the witches in terms of magical ability. But I would say that the Harry Potter franchise has overall helped humanize witches and wizards. We saw them live as people, we saw them learn and adapt to this like new world around them, we saw how they made the same mistakes that we make in our everyday lives, but it's even better because it's with magic. So Harry Potter presents these fantasy characters from a whole different perspective compared to, as I mentioned, other fantasy stories. So it helps us sympathize with these witches and accomplished something that is so significant. It made witches and wizards more human. Hermione is a great example of this because she combines so many admirable qualities that a witch could have. In conclusion, as times move, the portrayal and like the witch archetype has also changed as they've become more human, and especially taking into consideration what ancient philosophers said about women, how they were like subhumans, for example. But now witches are no longer shallow. Instead, they are shown as full characters. They're capable of achieving moral goodness, and it makes sense that contemporary society really appreciates the symbol of witches because it's really flexible and it shows empowerment of what a witch can represent. And this is the reason why so many people across the world are turning to paganism and Wicca. Thank you, that's it. Have a spooky rest of the month.